The Call of the Weird, written and read by Louis Theroux. One cold December day 9 years ago, I met up with an elderly racist leader named Pastor Richard Butler. I was making a documentary about right-wing apocalyptic Christians who've retreated to the American Northwest, Idaho especially, in preparation for the end times. Butler's outfit, Aryan Nations, represented the far end of that spectrum, a strange racist group that styled itself a church. It was the most famous neo-Nazi organization in America at that time, much beloved of tattooed skinheads and angry convicts, and linked to at least one white power terrorist cell that had gone on the rampage in the 80s. Butler picked me up in Hayden, Idaho, in a creaky old Cadillac, accompanied by an aide-de-camp, whom he introduced as Reverend Jerry Grudel. The pastor was then in his 80s and pretty decrepit. Jerry was in his 60s, pudgy, wearing thick glasses and a cowboy hat. The pastor hunched over the wheel of the car, and as we sped through the snow-covered countryside, Jerry shared his love of English culture, the comedy of Benny Hill, the scenery around Cheltenham, Gloucestershire, where he'd stayed during his stint in the army in the 50s. We drove up a rough driveway, through a pine forest, past a sign saying, "Whites Only," into a clearing with a church and a guard tower and scattered mobile homes. The walls of the pastor's office were stocked with racist leaflets in metal holders. Cold and cluttered, it was like the office of an underfunded charitable organization. Butler wanted to open the mail, so Jerry offered to take me on a tour of the rest of the compound. A sign said, "God has a plan for homosexuals. AIDS is the beginning." The church itself was a perfect combination of mildness and menace, like a village chapel, but with swastikas on the altar and on the wall. "Anybody who's white is welcome," Jerry said. We went up a ladder into the guard tower, and there, as we stood looking out on miles of white wilderness, Jerry announced his great fondness for the TV program Are You Being Served? This surprised me, that an American neo-Nazi should have heard of a relatively obscure British sitcom from the 70s, that he should have enjoyed its broad, sexual innuendo-based comedy. We talked about some of the characters. Jerry mentioned liking Mrs. Slocum, the bawdy old saleswoman in the lingerie department. I asked him what he thought of Mr. Humphreys, an effeminate sales assistant whose catchphrase, "I'm free," implied that he might be available for gay sex. Jerry looked confused for a moment, then said he thought he was disgusting. In a playful mood, I asked Jerry to say Mr. Humphrey's catchphrase. "But I'm not free," Jerry said, "because this country's in bondage to the Jews." A little later, having done my interview with Pastor Butler, I left the headquarters of Aryan Nations and returned to England. Time passed, and I moved on to other stories, but occasionally I found myself thinking about my visit to Aryan Nations and the strangeness of that conversation with Jerry in the guard tower. I found excuses to stay in touch with him, sent him copies of my documentaries, including the one he appeared in. Gradually I fell out of contact with Jerry, but I never forgot him. The weird contrast of his warm, human qualities, combined with the hatefulness of his beliefs, set a kind of gold standard for the journalism I was doing. As the years passed and I made more episodes of my TV series, Jerry was joined in my mental scrapbook by a handful of other characters whose fates I continued to be curious about long after the interviews were over. A UFO believer named Thor Templar, who claimed to have killed 10 aliens. A pimp named Mellow T, who was pursuing a career as a gangster rapper. A young porn performer who worked under the name J.J. Michaels. As I had with Jerry, from time to time I would phone or email and ask how everything was going. Gradually, my thoughts took shape in an idea. A reunion tour. A 6-month trip around the States, catching up with 10 of my most intriguing ex-interviewees. An update on both them and their weird worlds. The more I thought about it, the more I liked this idea. I'd been interviewing odd people for almost 10 years. I was ready for a break. It would be a chance to work in a different way, getting closer to the people I was covering, without the sense of performance that the camera inevitably brings.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?